Can a historical myth be unbustable? Here's what I mean by that. Sometimes, when you're exploring the past, you come across a figure whose reputation has quite obviously been inflated by legend or, conversely, tarnished by slander. But usually, with a bit of research, some critical reading, and a close comparison of historical sources, we can disprove many of these misconceptions. We can bust the myth, or at least add some nuance to the story. I mean, obviously this kind of stuff is my bread and butter here. But are some myths bust-proof? There are rare cases where it seems pretty clear that the story that's been preserved about a person or an event is skewed in some way. A figure seems a little too perfect, or things seem to unfold in a way that seems a little too close to a well-known storytelling trope. But we have no evidence to support a different reading. This can often be the case with religious figures. If you're not a believer, then you're likely going to be skeptical about the miraculous tales associated with Moses, the Buddha, Jesus, or the Prophet Muhammad. But trying to find a historical source pertaining to the life of those figures that's not been written or redacted by their religious followers can be a difficult and often impossible thing to do. You might smell a myth, but with no available evidence to contradict it, that myth might prove to be unbustable. This can also happen with national heroes, people who have been held up as the embodiment of a particular national or cultural identity. Sometimes the reputation of a national hero can become so unassailable that getting a clear picture of who they actually were can be difficult. I would argue that this is the case with one of Korea's most celebrated historical figures, the Admiral Yi Sunsin, savior of the Korean people and hero of the Great East Asian War, or what Koreans call the Imjin War. In a 2019 Gallup poll, Admiral Yi ranked number 1 on a list of historical figures South Koreans respect the most. To give you a sense of his competition, the number 2 person on that list was King Sejong the Great, the beloved 15th century Joseon dynasty monarch who was instrumental in creating the Korean alphabet. King Sejong is widely regarded as Korea's golden age king, and still, Admiral Yi tops the list. There are many reasons for this. Admiral Yi's exploits on the high seas during the Great East Asian War were truly impressive. His use of the redesigned and uniquely Korean gobuksan, or turtle ships, can't help but capture the imagination. His unjust betrayal, torture at the hands of lesser men, return to glory, and ultimate martyrdom, well, that can't help but remind you of another well-known figure. Admiral Yi's story really has everything. He's Horatio Nelson, George Patton, and Sun Tzu, with just a dash of, well, you know who. In the years that followed the Great East Asian War, one of the best read and most enduring histories of the conflict was a Korean memoir known as the Jingbirok. This was written by the Korean courtier Ru Song-yong, who had held a number of high-ranking positions in the court of the Korean king Seonjo during the war. This included the influential post of First State Counselor. Ru Song-yong was also Admiral Yi's greatest supporter at the Korean court. The title of this memoir translates roughly as The Book of Corrections, and was intended to be a clear-eyed look at the failures of the Korean government and the Joseon dynasty in defending the country in the early days of the war. The thing that needed to be corrected in the Book of Corrections was Korea's response to the Japanese threat. In the book, the author does not spare himself from criticism and often laments his own failings as an administrator. It reminds me a little bit of Winston Churchill's massive historical volumes about the First and Second World Wars. You get a valuable behind-the-scenes perspective, but you also need to remember that the author is far from impartial. To the credit of Ru Song-yong, he doesn't pat himself on the back quite as much as our guy Churchill. Still, the figure who comes out looking the best in the Book of Corrections is Admiral Yi Sunsin. In the author's estimation, Admiral Yi deserved more credit than any other Korean commander for the ultimate survival of the Joseon Kingdom. In the memoir, the author sincerely compares Admiral Yi's victories at sea to, quote, acts of divine providence, end quote. This book hugely influenced the historical reputation of Admiral Yi, a reputation that was only further buttressed by the stories of his heroics that appeared in the Imjin-nok, the fictionalized history of the Imjin War that I mentioned at the top of the last episode. So, for centuries, Admiral Yi was an unambiguous hero in Korea. But his historical reputation was supercharged in the early 20th century as a response to the Japanese occupation of Korea from 1910 to 1945. Koreans resisting the Japanese at that time gravitated towards the old war hero as he represented victory over the Japanese. His story could easily be framed as the Korean national spirit succeeding, even when the Korean government had failed. As such, Korean nationalist writers from this period returned to the story of Admiral Yi. When Korea regained its independence in 1945, the writings of these nationalists became increasingly popular. In these histories, Yi Sunsin became more than just a great Korean. He became the perfect Korean. The nationalist historian Shin Chae-ho wrote that Admiral Yi was, quote, both a hero and a saint, end quote. Similarly, the writings of Yi Gwang-soo emphasized not only Admiral Yi's military acumen, but also his moral excellence. Admiral Yi was a warrior poet, a great humanitarian, as well as a fierce combatant, a man whose only crime was being too honest and unwilling to play the corrupt games needed to get ahead in the court of King Sonjo. This image of Admiral Yi was seized upon by South Korea's autocratic military leader Park Chung-hee in the 1960s. President Park had a massive statue of the admiral erected in the middle of a major intersection in Seoul on the approach to the presidential palace. Park allegedly chose Admiral Yi for commemoration as he was, quote, a person most feared and admired by the Japanese, end quote. The image of Admiral Yi tapped into an anti-Japanese sentiment still keenly felt among Koreans after the occupation. It also didn't hurt that Admiral Yi was a military man, an obvious choice of hero for a military dictatorship. The massive statue in Seoul, which still stands today, was just the start. President Park had statues of Yi erected all over the country, and even commissioned Admiral Yi miniatures to be sent to elementary schools all over South Korea. Now, as I was researching this, I discovered that some controversy arose around Admiral Yi's statue in Seoul when it was being restored in 2010. And at first I thought, of course, this statue must now be seen as a symbol of the deeply controversial Park regime. Opinions about the legacy of Park Chung-hee are quite divided in South Korea. Some older Koreans defend Park's autocratic rule as essential to Korea's economic revival. but many Koreans under the age of 40 view Park as a dictator who stood in the way of the country becoming truly democratic. I guessed that this debate about the legacy of the Park regime had surely spilled over into discussions about the future of the statue. I guessed wrong. It seems that despite Park Chung-hee's best efforts, most Koreans do not immediately associate Admiral Yi with Park's mid-20th century military government. Even President Park's fiercest critics don't seem to think that the statue of Admiral Yi has been sullied by its connection to the military government. This seems to be because, at this point, nothing can really sully the reputation of Admiral Yi in South Korea. It turns out the debate about the statue in 2010 was about whether it looked heroic enough. At the time, some Koreans were concerned that the way that Admiral Yi was depicted, that is, holding his sword scabbard in his right hand, might be misinterpreted as a sign of surrender. According to some, this giant patriotic statue needed to look more unambiguously heroic. It's honestly one of the more surprising public history debates I've come across. The two sides were like, that statue is just heroic enough and reflects how we thought about heroism in the 1960s, opposed to, well, I'm just concerned that the younger generation will grow up thinking that Admiral Yi was just okay, when they should understand that he was awesome. So, when that is the public profile of a historical figure, one can't help but smell some myth-making. In fact, most serious historians of Korean history note that Admiral Yi's reputation has been swollen to mythic proportions. In his analysis of the Korean Navy during the Great East Asian War, the historian Yi Min-ung makes the point that most existing writing on the topic is, quote, marked by extolling individual heroism and patriotic martyrdom, end quote. Everybody knows that there is a mythic elephant in the room. But the myth of Admiral Yi might be unbustable. If there's a counter-narrative out there that Admiral Yi isn't all that he's cracked up to be, I've yet to find it. Different sources will vary in how effusive or hyperbolic their praise is. But the stories about Admiral Yi are never really different. You see, I've learned that if I'm going to take on a beloved national hero, I need to come correct. I need to have clear historical evidence that I can point to that demonstrates that the popular understanding of this beloved figure is wrong. In the case of Admiral Yi, I have not been able to find that evidence. Everything we have is very complimentary of the Admiral. That may be because he was just that great, or because differing opinions were scrubbed out of the record a long time ago. But I can't prove that. Just like his statue in Seoul, modern historians of the Great East Asian War are left debating whether or not Admiral Yi was pretty heroic or super-duper goat-level heroic. So, how does Korea's most respected historical figure fit into this story? Let's see if we can get to it today on Our Fake History. Episode number 202, What Was the Great East Asian War? Part 2. Hello and welcome to Our Fake History. My name is Sebastian Major, and this is the podcast where we explore historical myths and try to determine what's fact, what's fiction, and what is such a good story that it simply must be told. Before we get going this week, this is just a reminder that an ad-free version of this podcast is available through Patreon. Just go to patreon.com/OurFakeHistory to get access to an ad-free feed and a huge collection of extra episodes, including the most recent patrons-only episode on Merlin the Wizard. The patrons seem to be digging it. I've been getting lots of great feedback, and even the Merlin skeptics in the crowd seem to be enjoying the show. So, if you want to hear that episode and all the other awesome extras that we have on offer at Patreon, go to patreon.com/OurFakeHistory and see the level of support that works for you. If you want the whole enchilada, including that ad-free feed, then start supporting at $5 or more every month. That's patreon.com/OurFakeHistory. This week, we are returning to a conflict known in Korea as the Imjin War, but is also known by scholars as the Great East Asian War. Now, this is part 2 of what is going to be a trilogy of episodes on this topic. So if you've not heard part 1, then I strongly suggest that you go back and give that show a listen now. In that first part, I did my best to set the stage for this trilogy. I introduced the idea that this conflict has been unfairly overlooked outside of Korea, especially given the number of soldiers involved and the fact that it sucked in the most militarily sophisticated Asian empires of the era. As such, I agree with those scholars who think that this conflict should be more widely known as the First Great East Asian War. Next, I discussed the unique challenges of looking into this historical conflict, given the biases inherent in the Japanese, Korean, and Chinese sources, and the admitted inadequacies of the English language books on the topic. As such, I felt I needed to be extra transparent about my sources this time out. From there, we turned our focus to Japan and explained the rise of the Japanese leader Toyotomi Hideyoshi in the late stages of Japan's Sengoku Jidai, or the Warring States period. I did my best to show how this war in Korea was a direct outgrowth of more than a century of civil war in Japan. We finished off that episode exploring the reasons why Toyotomi Hideyoshi embarked on the ambitious project of trying to conquer Ming China by way of Korea. We saw that while sometimes this gets ascribed to Hideyoshi's megalomania, that explanation isn't really satisfying. Instead, it seems like maintaining order in Japan, keeping the ambitious Japanese lords, or daimyo, flush with honors, lands, and rewards, and keeping the still mobilized Japanese armies fighting people who were not Japanese were likely at the front of Hideyoshi's mind. The breakdown in trade between Japan and China during the Sengoku era also created a situation where Hideyoshi needed to get trade flowing again with the mainland. Conquest seemed like the only option for restarting trade without Toyotomi Hideyoshi having to humble himself in front of the Ming Emperor in Beijing. The last episode was focused mostly on Japan. So today, in part 2, I want to look more closely at Korea, and then, of course, finally get into the thick of this conflict. In Japan, the 150 years leading up to the Great East Asian War had been characterized by a chaotic state of multi-directional civil war. But the situation could not have been more different in the Korean peninsula. 1592, the Imjin year, which marked the start of the Japanese invasion of Korea, also marked the 200th anniversary of the foundation of Korea's Joseon dynasty. Officially founded in 1392, the Joseon dynasty would prove to be Korea's most sturdy and long-lived ruling order. The Joseon dynasty would last nearly 600 years before transforming into the short-lived Korean Empire in the late 19th century. But of course, Korea's history stretches back long before the founding of the Joseon dynasty. The national myth of Korea is that the first Korean king, Tonggun, was the son of a she-bear who had been transformed into a human woman by a god around 5,000 years ago. But the Korean historian Kyung-moon Hwang has argued that the first distinctly Korean, or perhaps Proto-Korean, state on the peninsula, supported by reliable historical records, was the Goguryeo Kingdom, founded sometime in the 1st century BC. By the time the Joseon dynasty was founded in 1392, the peninsula had seen the rise and fall of a number of distinct kingdoms. At one point, the peninsula was divided into 3 kingdoms. This was known as the Three Kingdoms period. The kingdom of Silla ended up absorbing its rivals and nearly unifying all of what we think of as modern Korea. Silla eventually gave way to the Goryeo Kingdom in the late 10th century. That kingdom was able to assert its control over the entire peninsula, and more or less fixed its borders where the modern states of North and South Korea are today. In this period, the Yalu River in the north took shape as the ultimate border of what is considered Korea. And yes, there are some who will argue that all of Manchuria is also historically Korean, but man, that's a debate for another day. The Goryeo Kingdom also integrated the cultures of the previous 3 kingdoms and created the basis for the modern Korean identity. Even the English word for the country of Korea is derived from the name of this kingdom, Goryeo, Korea. It was in this period that Korea first started to get an international reputation, and that reputation was, for the most part, quite positive. In the year 947, an Arab historian would write this about the Korean peninsula, quote, "Seldom has a stranger who has come there from Iraq or another country left it afterwards. So healthy is the air there, so pure the water, so fertile the soil, and so plentiful all the good things." End quote. Sounds nice. While a little unsolicited praise from the Islamic world was certainly appreciated, Koreans were mostly focused on the relationship with their largest neighbor, China, the Middle Kingdom. Much of Korea's history right up to the late 19th century was defined by a particularly close relationship with China. As author Samuel Hawley has put it, quote, "The Koreans based their culture on Chinese culture. They studied Chinese history and the writings of Chinese sages. They modeled their court after the Chinese court, shaped their government administration along Chinese lines, and clothed their officials in Chinese robes. They made Chinese morals their morals, Chinese laws their laws, and considered the Chinese mode of conduct superior to anything else." End quote. Now, I know that some Koreans might bristle at that quote, as it's become controversial in some quarters to suggest that Korean culture was overly influenced by outsiders. As I mentioned in the last episode, the Japanese occupation of the early 20th century came along with a pernicious attempt to destroy Korean culture and identity. The Japanese of that period taught a skewed and frankly falsified version of East Asian history that sought to erase the achievements of the Korean kingdoms and scrub away the historical basis for a unique Korean identity. When Koreans reclaimed their independence, they were also keen to reclaim their history. Many wanted to emphasize the uniqueness and historical distinctiveness of Korea to counter years of Japanese propaganda that Korea had barely existed. This was an understandable impulse. Koreans did not want to be written out of their own history. So, to be clear, these Korean kingdoms were distinct and sovereign, albeit in a tributary relationship with the Chinese court. Koreans had a unique language, cuisine, customs, and artistic traditions. After the reign of King Sejong in the early 1400s, they also had their own unique phonetic alphabet, quite different from the Chinese characters used throughout much of East Asia. The Korean alphabet has been called by historian Michael J. Seth one of the most logical and scientific writing systems ever developed anywhere on Earth. The distinctiveness of the Korean identity cannot and should not be denied. Now, that might seem like an almost ridiculous thing to say in 2024, when no one is really denying the existence of a Korean identity. But as I have learned, the experience of having your culture suppressed and your history denied is a trauma not quickly forgotten. So, I think it's worthwhile to be crystal clear on that point. However, to understand this era of Korean history at all, you need to understand the influence of China, which was massive. In the 1500s, the influence of the Chinese was not a controversial thing in Korea. Chinese culture was simply synonymous with civilization, and Koreans prided themselves on being exceptionally civilized. The text known as the Tongmong Sun Sup, which was for generations considered required reading as part of a classical Korean education, proudly states, quote, "We made our customs like that of the flowery land, so that the Chinese themselves praise us, saying, 'Korea is little China,'" end quote. According to this text, Koreans thought being little China was high praise. The relationship between Korea and China would shift and change over the centuries depending on which dynasties happened to hold power in both countries. However, in the period of the Great East Asian War, the relationship between the two countries was quite close, and this was because the two ruling dynasties had come up together. The Ming dynasty in China had risen to power in 1368 after the collapse of the Mongol-led Yuan dynasty. In Korea, the founder of the Joseon dynasty, a former general in the previous regime, swept into power, favoring a close alliance with the newly ascendant Ming in China. The Joseon dynasty was thus legitimized and given added clout by its close relationship with the Ming court in Beijing. As such, the Joseon dynasty entered into a tributary relationship with the Ming. Joseon monarchs recognized that the Ming emperor was the quote-unquote celestial emperor, who mediated between heaven and earth. In return, the Ming emperor recognized that the Joseon rulers were the kings of Korea, with sovereign authority over the peninsula south of the Yalu River. The king of Korea was expected to make tribute payments to the Ming emperor. But, as I mentioned in the last episode, these tribute missions were actually the way that trade was done between the two kingdoms. Nearly as much wealth flowed back to Korea as was sent to China in the form of these tribute/trade missions. For 2 centuries, Joseon Korea was considered the model tributary state by Ming officials. Korean delegates were allowed to sit in a place of honor at the Ming court. The Koreans of the era seem to have really taken some pride in this, being quite happy to have a more prestigious seat at court than diplomats from other tributary states, like those in Southeast Asia. While technically all these tributary states were considered equals in this system, Korean historian Kyung-moon Hwang has explained that in this period, the Joseon dynasty prided itself on being, quote, the first among seconds, end quote. The Joseon dynasty of this period was also defined by the wholesale adoption of the political ideology associated with the Ming. That was Neo-Confucianism. Okay, now I could easily get lost explaining the philosophical, moral, and ethical nuances of Neo-Confucianism. But for our story here, here's what you need to know. Neo-Confucianism was a revival of the teachings of the beloved ancient Chinese philosopher Confucius. But like any revival, these traditional teachings were modified, honed, and in some ways intensified by a group of later scholars. At the core of this philosophical system was a belief that harmony, peace, and good order could be achieved if the correct relationships between things were properly maintained. Here's what I mean. Confucians believed that there were hierarchies that could be observed everywhere in existence. There was a natural hierarchy in nature, a hierarchy in the human body, a hierarchy in the family, a hierarchy in the state, a hierarchy in international relations, and a hierarchy in heaven. Things were best when one knew their spot in these various hierarchies and acted accordingly. In the case of the family, children honored and obeyed their parents, but in turn, parents cared for and protected their children. Similarly, in society, subjects were expected to obey and honor their social superiors, but those superiors were supposed to act charitably and benevolently towards their lessers. The emperor was to be honored and worshipped, but he was also supposed to rule with an eye towards peace, harmony, and balance. That system of tribute-based trade I described earlier is a perfect example of this. The King of Korea notes his subordinate status to the Emperor of China, but then the Emperor rewards the King of Korea with gifts. Everyone wins, and the balance is preserved, at least in theory. Now, of course, this is just the tip of the iceberg, but hopefully you're getting the idea. Now, both Ming China and Joseon Korea were administered by these huge court bureaucracies. To get a post in the government, you needed to pass a civil service exam that was entirely based on the Neo-Confucian curriculum. Now, this meant that in theory, there was a level of meritocracy in this system. Anyone who passed these exams could potentially serve in government. But in practice, it took years of expensive schooling to even have a chance at passing the exams. So, inevitably, it was overwhelmingly people from wealthy aristocratic families who ended up taking and passing the civil service exams. These exams also had nothing to do with the actual work of government administration. They were entirely based on the students' knowledge of key Confucian texts and the approved Neo-Confucian commentaries on those texts. It was common for students to study these texts so rigorously that they could recite them from memory. The thinking was that if you staffed your government with good, moral Confucians who understood philosophy and could write beautifully, then they could learn the rest on the job. These government positions became a real source of prestige among the aristocracy in both China and Korea. As such, they became more sought after than positions in the armed forces. In this period, a career in the army or the navy was seen as less impressive than passing the civil service exam and getting a position in the court bureaucracy. Now, to be clear, there is lots of debate among historians concerning the state of the Ming and the Korean armed forces before 1592. The historian Kenneth Swope has even argued that the Ming could be understood as having a military revival in the lead up to the Great East Asian War. However, few deny that in Korea, ambivalent feelings among the Neo-Confucian government class towards the military affected how the early stages of the war unfolded. Finally, it's important to understand that in both China and Korea, this class of government administrators was deeply divided by rival factions. Now, from a historical distance, all political factionalism looks petty, stupid, and counterproductive. I have no doubt that in the future, people will look at our time, the time we're living in right now, and they will shake their heads at how political one-upmanship, obstructionism, and the prioritizing of party loyalty kept Western democracies from addressing any of the most pressing issues of our time in a meaningful way. In that sense, the governments of China and Korea in the late 16th century were no different. Except, in those governments, the different factions didn't have any real ideological differences. They were all dyed-in-the-wool Neo-Confucians. Instead, the factions were entirely based around personal loyalty and patronage. You see, Joseon Korea became so deeply ensconced in the ideology of Neo-Confucianism that eventually they set up something known as the censorate. This was a government agency that was meant to police corruption and malfeasance among government officials. In Korea, the so-called three offices also policed the moral and philosophical purity of everyone in government, including the king. The censors could officially criticize government appointments and even get policy changed if it was not considered consistent with Neo-Confucian philosophy. Now, this comparison is not perfect, so I don't want to take it too far, but this was kind of a Neo-Confucian inquisition operating within the Korean government. Getting accused by the censorate of corruption, impiety, or improper conduct could get you sacked and, depending on the severity of the accusation, executed. In Korea, the court factions began as a way to protect oneself against denunciation to the censors. Old, respected political veterans would promise political cover and words of defense to younger colleagues, just in case they were ever accused of anything. In return, those veterans would build up a collection of younger colleagues who would defend them if they ever were accused of anything. This informal system of court alliances eventually hardened into two clear factions in the Korean court. They became known as the Easterners and the Westerners. These factions vied for influence and competed over court appointments. But there were no real ideological differences here. They were all Neo-Confucians, and they all deeply supported the Joseon dynasty. All the disagreements were over smaller policy questions, and often differences were manufactured just so one side could get the edge on the other. The Easterners might think a Western proposal was good, but they would speak against it because you can't let the Easterners get a win. This dynamic would hugely affect how Korea fought the war in 1592. So, let's go to 1592 and explore the opening moves of the Great East Asian War. In 1592, the Joseon dynasty was in its 200th year, and the monarch, King Sonjo, was 25 years deep into his reign. While factionalism and a type of fundamentalist Confucianism was starting to seriously impede the operation of government, the preceding 200 years of Joseon rule had largely been prosperous, stable, and peaceful. In fact, the early Joseon era often gets looked back on as a bit of a golden age in Korean history. And while we need to be careful not to overly romanticize this period, there's no doubting that in the 15th and early 16th centuries, there were certainly worse places to live than the Korean peninsula. But it's generally accepted that when the Japanese attacked in the Imjin year of 1592, the Koreans were not ready. Or more accurately, they were not as ready as they needed to be. Part of this had to do with a litany of diplomatic misunderstandings that would almost be funny if they'd not ended up leading to such a tragic conflict. Now, it's not like better diplomacy would have averted this war. Toyotomi Hideyoshi had clearly made up his mind about this invasion, and no amount of clever negotiation could have stopped him. Hideyoshi had proposed that the Koreans just stand aside while his army marched through their country towards the ultimate goal of Ming China. But this was completely unacceptable. The Japanese would end up sending 2 separate emissaries to visit the Korean king Sonjo, bearing letters from Toyotomi Hideyoshi. Now, one of those letters I quoted from at length in part 1 of this series. That was the letter where Hideyoshi described his miraculous birth, described his destiny to conquer all of Asia, and laid out his plan to march through Korea on his way to Beijing. This letter had been delivered to the Korean court by Hideyoshi's first emissary, an old battle-scarred daimyo who had little time for what the Koreans considered essential diplomatic decorum. The Koreans already had prejudices that the Japanese were uncultured barbarians, and this first envoy seemed to live up to that stereotype. What's more, this letter he had with him did not follow the proper conventions of diplomatic letters written from one vassal king to another. Hideyoshi was using a verb tense that was supposed to be reserved for the Emperor of China. Now, the conclusion should have been that Hideyoshi was dead serious about dethroning the Ming Emperor and seizing that title for himself. But instead, King Sonjo and his courtiers concluded that this letter was so rude, impetuous, and lacking in decorum that it should not be taken seriously. The Koreans still did not even understand Toyotomi's role in the Japanese government, which, to be fair, was super convoluted. As far as they were concerned, this guy was a nobody who hadn't paid close enough attention in letter writing class. Neo-Confucians really cared about letter writing class. The second envoy from the Japanese fared only slightly better, in that he was able to impress on at least some members of the Korean court that Hideyoshi needed to be handled delicately. So King Sonjo agreed to send a diplomatic mission to Kyoto to take the measure of Toyotomi Hideyoshi. Now, Hideyoshi had asked his emissary to get the Koreans to send a tribute mission to formally offer their submission. He was expecting a member of the royal household, if not the king, then at least a royal prince or maybe one of the king's brothers. He wanted someone of that rank to come to Japan and formally submit to his overlordship. It seems that the Japanese emissary, understanding that the Koreans would have rejected that out of hand, softened the demand considerably once he got to the Korean court. So the delegation sent by King Sonjo was sent to Kyoto with no plans to submit to the Japanese. They were there just to open up friendly communication. To do this, Sanjo sent 2 mid-ranking court officials, one from the eastern faction and one from the western faction. Their trip to Japan ended up being its own kind of debacle. Toyotomi Hideyoshi was annoyed and insulted that the Koreans had sent what he perceived to be 2 low-ranking courtiers. He wanted a royal prince. So, Hideyoshi decided to pull some power moves. First, he kept the delegation waiting for 4 months. When he finally received the Koreans, instead of throwing the expected lavish banquet, he served the delegates some basic rice cakes and a modest serving of rice wine. Now, to the Neo-Confucian Koreans who had spent their life mastering banquet etiquette, this was a scandal and a mockery of decorum. Things got even more shocking when Hideyoshi suddenly left the hall in the middle of the meal and returned wearing informal clothing. Okay, now I know that may not sound like a big deal, but think of it like this. Imagine you were visiting the White House for a state dinner, and halfway through, the president leaves the room and comes back in wearing a hoodie and some sweatpants. If you were dressed in a tuxedo, you might think this feels kind of weird. We're told that Hideyoshi was then handed his baby and walked around the room casually until the baby peed on him. Hideyoshi had a good laugh about this, handed the baby off to one of his many nannies, left the room, and never came back. The Korean delegates were beside themselves, totally shocked. Hideyoshi seems to have been making the point that he didn't need to stand on ceremony for anyone. He could do what he wanted. It's like Lyndon Johnson taking a meeting while he's sitting on the toilet, if you've ever heard that story. Who knows? That might be a historical myth, but that's a story that's out there. But interestingly, the 2 Korean delegates ended up making 2 very different assessments of all of this. When those 2 men returned to Korea and made their report to King Sanjo and the rest of the court, they told 2 very different tales. And because the 2 ambassadors were from 2 different political factions, the issue became politicized. Samuel Hawley summarizes it like this, quote, "The Western faction member described Hideyoshi as having the piercing eyes of a man of resourcefulness and daring. He seemed fully prepared to start a war," the ambassador said, "and posed a great danger to Korea." The Easterner strongly disagreed. Hideyoshi had the eyes of a rat, he countered, and he was not to be overly feared. He did not pose a danger and would not start a war. There was, in short, no pressing need to take defensive measures. With the balance of power in the capital now swinging back in the Easterners' favor, the assessment made by the Eastern ambassador was afforded the most weight. End quote. I'm sure you could imagine what would happen if one of the major political parties in your country refused to acknowledge the potential severity of a looming threat. Even if that political faction didn't have complete control of every level of government, they could still make it hard to address the issue in a fulsome way. In Korea in the late 16th century, this meant that war preparations were uneven and hampered by political gridlock. Eventually, after months, some within the Eastern faction finally conceded that maybe a small attack was coming and some preparations needed to be made. So, in the southern provinces, conscription was tightened up, key southern towns were refortified, and new walls were built. On top of that, arsenals were restocked, and weapons were distributed. Now, this is where one of our key Korean sources comes in, the so-called Book of Corrections by Yi Sunsin. As the title of that book suggests, it's all about what the Joseon Kingdom should have done differently in 1592 and beyond. Now, as I mentioned earlier, in that book, the author expresses regret and even admits his own mistakes. But one can't help but notice that he still comes out looking pretty good. You see, the author, who I'll just be calling you moving forward, had been a lifelong government official. One of those guys who passed the Confucian exam and entered the prestigious world of public service. Over the course of his career, he held many different positions. But in 1591, on the eve of the Japanese invasion, he was elevated to the influential position of Minister of the Left. This made him like the second most important advisor to the king. Now, despite the fact that Yu was aligned with the Eastern faction, he tells us that he broke with the party line and started to advocate for improvements to Korean defenses. He also started advocating at court for the one military official who seemed to be capable and had a clear understanding of the threat that was on their doorstep. Yi Sunsin. It didn't hurt that Yi and Yu had been childhood friends. Now, my fake history spidey sense tingles a little bit when a memoir writer claims that on the eve of war, the only two people who really understood what was going on were him and his best friend. But I have no facts that contradict that version of events. So, that's what we have. But finally, this brings us to the man of the hour, Admiral Yi Sunsin. Yi Sunsin was born in Seoul in 1545. And a quick word on that place name. In this period, Seoul was technically called Han-sung or Han-yang. However, in the middle of the Joseon period, Koreans started informally calling the city Seoul. Eventually, that name would entirely eclipse the old formal titles. So, for the rest of the series, I'm going to use the name Seoul for the capital city, as it's the name that most people are familiar with. But I need to recognize that we're in a bit of a historical gray area where the city was known by a few different names. Okay, so Yi Sunsin was born in Seoul into a noble but not particularly wealthy family. The story goes that Yi demonstrated a certain genius at a young age, and his parents hoped that he would train for the civil service exams. This, of course, would set him on the path towards a prestigious career as a government administrator. But much to his parents' dismay, Yi Sunsin chose instead to pursue a career in the military, which at the time was considered a more humble calling for someone born into the Korean upper crust. Often, this is presented as a principled decision on the part of young Yi, as he chose the path of sacrifice and service rather than the path of personal prestige and comfort. Now, I cannot contradict this version of events, but let me tell you some things I've learned about the Korean military in this period. The officer corps in this period often attracted the less talented children from aristocratic families. If you had a son who had a hard time passing the rigorous civil service exam, the Army or the Navy were face-saving second choices. Like the civil service, to become an officer in the Korean military, you needed to pass an exam that was based on the Chinese military classics, like Sun Tzu's Art of War. This was also supplemented with a display of flashy horsemanship. So, you ended up getting a crop of aristocratic officers for whom the military was a second choice. They loved riding horses, but their knowledge of combat came entirely from centuries-old Chinese texts. Now, our sources tell us that Yi Sunsin was absolutely not one of these spoiled fail sons. However, some historians suspect that given the fact that all the sources agree that Yi Sunsin came from a less wealthy aristocratic family, he may have pursued a career in the military because his family could not afford the years of private tutelage one needed to pass the civil service exam. So, the road to the top was rocky for young Yi. He was not immediately successful in his attempt to join the officer corps. We're told that during his first exam, he fell from his horse during the horsemanship section and badly broke his leg. Now, the story goes that after this tragic fall, Yi got up, limped towards a nearby willow tree, grabbed some fallen branches, and crafted for himself an improvised leg splint. With his leg splinted with tree branches, he then remounted his horse and finished the exam. Despite this superhuman act of determination, the fall still cost him a passing grade. Now, what do we do with a story like this? Seems a little exaggerated. Samuel Hawley includes the story of the fall from the horse in his history, but he leaves out the detail about the improvised splint. Kenneth Swope doesn't even touch this story. I learned this story after scouring the internet for tales about Admiral Yi. In all of the more sober-minded histories I read, this story was simply missing. It's one of those stories that seems like a myth, so historians just leave it out. But they also don't spend any time disproving it, so once again, take it or leave it. From there, we're told that the determined young Yi Sunsin returned home, healed his wounds, and started the process all over again. He passed the exam on his second attempt, but by that point, he was already 31 years old, which was considered a rather advanced age to be starting a military career. For the next 15 years, Yi found himself unable to ascend beyond the middle ranks of the officer corps. The reason, we're told, was that he was too honest and too averse to corruption. Getting ahead in the 16th century Korean military meant getting involved with a clique of influential friends, occasionally bribing a superior, and throwing a rival under the bus whenever you could. Yi Sunsin, we're told, was simply too upstanding to play this game. So, for years, this courageous, bright, and incorruptible officer was stuck in the middle ranks, as he was constantly getting blocked by more cunning but less capable rivals. Things finally changed on the eve of the Great East Asian War. When Yu Song-yong became the minister of the left, he recommended his childhood friend be promoted to the lofty position of commander of the Chola Left Navy. At the time, most Korean coastal provinces had 4 key military commands: Right Army, Left Army, Right Navy, and Left Navy. The Chola province was on the strategically important southwest coast of the Korean peninsula. The Chola navies, both left and right, were going to be essential in resisting any Japanese attack. So, being the commander of the Chola Left Navy was a huge promotion. It very quickly made the now Admiral Yi one of the most important people in the Korean military. Ironically, the man whose career had been defined by a principled rejection of nepotism was rocketed to the top because of a well-connected and influential friend. Life's funny like that, I suppose. But Yi took this command quite seriously and quickly set about repairing, refitting, and in some cases, commissioning new builds for the Chola Left Navy. More on that later. In the haphazard preparations for the Japanese attack, Yi distinguished himself as one of the few people who understood the scope of the threat. He correctly assessed Korea's strengths and weaknesses and planned accordingly. Now, interestingly, in 1592, the Korean Navy was easily the best equipped and most formidable wing of Korea's armed forces. In the decades leading up to the war, one of the most persistent threats to Korea's security had been pirate raids carried out by groups known as the Wako Pirates, who were based out of Japanese ports and thrived during the chaos of Japan's civil wars. One of the ways that Korea had been dealing with this pirate threat was by building a fairly impressive navy. The Korean coast was a famously challenging place to sail, with high winds, strong tides, and many hidden rocks and shoals close to shore. This meant that over the centuries, Korean shipbuilding had favored sturdy vessels, stable in rough seas, with thickly built wooden hulls. The gem of this fleet were the PodcastOne warships, thick-hulled vessels powered by both oars and sails, and armed with a huge variety of cannon. This was especially important. Once again, we get a really interesting parallel here between this conflict and the nearly contemporaneous Anglo-Spanish War. As you might remember from those Spanish Armada episodes, in 1588, the Spanish favored a type of naval warfare that involved getting close to enemy ships and then boarding them, whereas the English focused on gunnery that gave them better range. The same dynamic played out between the Japanese and the Koreans. The Japanese used their warships like giant platforms on which they could fight land battles at sea. Their tactics involved getting close to the enemy, boarding the vessels, and then killing as many sailors as they could. Sinking the ships was of secondary importance. The Koreans, on the other hand, were all about the firepower. Their ships were equipped with a huge number of cannon that could blast their enemy from a distance. For the Koreans, killing sailors was secondary to sinking ships. But while the Koreans had the Japanese outgunned at sea, the opposite was true on land. By 1592, the Japanese had fully incorporated the arquebus into their military. These were expertly crafted Japanese muskets that had been based on an earlier Portuguese design. The arquebus had been key to the unification of Japan, and the commanders tapped by Hideyoshi to lead the invasion of Korea had become masters of using peasant units, or ashigaru, armed with arquebuses as shock troops. The Koreans had gunpowder weapons, mostly in the form of stationary cannon, but the arquebus, and handheld firearms in general, were still quite new in Korea. The Korean army was still largely armed with the traditional swords, pikes, and bows and arrows. The Japanese were coming with guns. Okay, so let's take a quick break here, and when we return, we'll get into the first phase of the Japanese onslaught. On May 23, 1592, the Japanese arrived in Korea. Even the most stubborn, there will be no war Easterners had accepted that something was coming. But no one in Korea could imagine the size and scope of the invasion force that arrived that May. The Japanese launched their invasion from the island of Tsushima, a Japanese-aligned midway point between the main Japanese islands and the Korean mainland. The Japanese force would eventually number over 150,000 Japanese soldiers. But the initial wave was around a third of that. They came in a fleet of around 700 transport vessels. Once again, if you needed more evidence that this event was super important, and maybe that the Spanish Armada episode was a little overblown, well, the Spanish Armada, which gets described as an impossibly huge fleet of ships, consisted of roughly 130 ships. Just 4 years later, Toyotomi Hideyoshi put together 700 vessels for his campaign. Now, to be clear, this Japanese armada was not made up of 700 warships. Most of these ships were small enough to pass as fishing boats. A huge number of these vessels were only armed with the handheld arquebuses carried by the soldiers that they were ferrying across. In fact, the Japanese commanders had been ordered by Hideyoshi to wait for a fleet of Japanese warships to join them as an escort. But the commanders, eager for glory and convinced that the Koreans were not going to be able to act fast enough to stop them, made a huge gamble and attempted the crossing to the Korean coastal city of Busan virtually undefended. This also gives you a sense of just how independent-minded these Japanese daimyo continued to be, despite being sworn to Toyotomi Hideyoshi. Now, this is one of the great what-if moments of the war. If the Korean Navy, specifically the left and right navies of the Gyeongsang province, had acted quickly and attacked these Japanese transports while they were at sea, they likely would have blown hundreds of ships out of the water and severely blunted the initial Japanese attack. But that is not what happened. The two Navy commanders of Gyeongsang province, Pak Hong and Won Kyun, had between them around 150 heavy Pankosan battleships. But when the mass of Japanese vessels appeared through the fog on that day, they panicked. Now, to be fair, the Koreans looked outnumbered, but these commanders didn't consider just how vulnerable the Japanese truly were. So, the Korean ships stayed in port while the commanders sent frantic messages for help. As such, the Japanese were able to land without any interference from the Korean Navy. They then stormed the fortified town of Busan. Records show that this initial fight was one of the bloodiest and most intensely contested of the early part of the war. The newly reinforced Korean defenses certainly helped, but the Japanese possessed a distinct technological advantage. Put simply, the Korean defenders were shooting arrows at Japanese soldiers armed with muskets. The masses of ashigaru, the peasant arquebusiers, proved to be a more lethal military unit than anything the Koreans had encountered in the past 2 centuries. Within a matter of hours, the walls of Busan had been breached. By the end of the day, the seemingly formidable Busan Castle was in the hands of the Japanese. The commander of the Gyeongsang Left Navy, Pak Hong, was so shaken by this that he made a decision so short-sighted and disastrous, it's hard to fully understand. Even in a situation where it seems like engaging in a fight would be futile, the next logical thing to do would be to take your fleet out to sea and try and make a run for it. Sail to safer waters, wait to fight another day. Pak Hong did not do that. Instead, assuming that all was lost, he ordered that his entire fleet, the whole Gyeongsang Left Navy, roughly 100 vessels, be scuttled. That means deconstructed, stripped of valuables, and in some cases, sunk. He then had all his weapons destroyed so they wouldn't fall into the hands of the enemy. Then, Pak Hong got on his horse and deserted his command. Roughly a quarter of the entire Korean Navy was destroyed just like that by one spooked commander. The commander of the right Navy, Won Kyun, didn't do much better. After he received a report about the fall of Busan and the scuttling of the left Navy, he chose to leave his base and sail to safer waters. Okay, reasonable. But then he came across a group of fishing boats that he accidentally mistook for the Japanese fleet. So he panicked and ordered that his fleet be scuttled. Most of his ships were destroyed in a self-inflicted wound, until one of his subordinates convinced him that the flagship and 3 other vessels should be saved, and that he should remain in command lest he be hunted as a traitorous deserter. Seeing the wisdom in this, Won Kyun took the advice. So it was that the Kyeonsang Right Navy was reduced from around 50 warships to exactly 4. Remember that name, Won Kyun, because he's going to come back. In fact, many accounts present him as the anti-Yi Sunsin. He would remain as a thorn in the side of the one capable Korean admiral. Luckily, Yi Sunsin and the Chola Right Navy commander Yi Ok-ki still had the Chola navies intact. But now they were on the back foot. The best plan was to bide their time and strike when the Japanese, now convinced that the Korean Navy was non-existent, would least expect it. After the Japanese established a beachhead in Busan and occupied one of Korea's largest coastal towns, things moved fast. Eventually, there would be many daimyo commanding forces in Korea, but the 2 Japanese commanders leading the charge from Busan north towards Seoul were Konishi Yukinaga and Kato Kiyomasa. For simplicity's sake, I will just be calling them Konishi and Kato. The dynamic between these 2 guys really underscores that Japan had not been unified for very long. These were rival daimyo who controlled each of their contingents like personal feudal armies. Because, in practice, they were essentially personal feudal armies. Both men were hungry for glory and deeply resentful when they felt like their rival had snatched away their chance to win some battlefield honor. Hideyoshi had told his commanders to work in concert and move as a united front through the Korean peninsula. But Konishi and Kato quickly found themselves locked in a race northward. Each daimyo wanted to have the distinction of being the Japanese commander who entered Seoul first. Now, this sounds like a recipe for disaster, and may have been, had the Koreans been better prepared and not so brutally outgunned by the Japanese muskets. Over the course of the next week, many of the recently refortified fortress towns in the south of Korea fell much in the same way as Busan. Despite the best efforts of the newly mustered Korean soldiers, these towns were overrun and thousands were put to the sword. Now, as you may or may not know, Korea is a mountainous country. The realities of this physical geography means that it can be a challenging place to move around with an army. In the 16th century, there were only a handful of good roads that could take an army through the many valleys and mountain passes that led north. This makes the speed of the Japanese progress north all the more remarkable. By June 6th, the forces of Kato and Konishi had made it through the so-called Bird Pass, a tight mountain pass about 130 kilometers south of Seoul. The last formidable geographic barrier between the Japanese vanguard and the capital was the Han River. So it was there, near the town of Cheongju, that the Korean army made a stand. This would be remembered as the Battle of Cheongju. The Koreans were commanded by General Sin Ip, whose battle strategy that day has been brutally criticized ever since. Normally, if you're a defender and you have a river that you can use in your defense, you keep that river between you and your enemy. Make the enemy cross the river. Crossing a river is hard to do and makes the enemy vulnerable. But Sin Ip, on the other hand, chose to array his army on the side of the Han River closest to the Japanese. The Korean army had the river at their back. That meant that if they needed to retreat, they were going into the river. This type of positioning has been called a death trap. But Samuel Hawley has argued that while Sin Ip's choices ultimately did no favors for the Korean army, they need to be understood in the context of the Chinese military classics that Korean officers had spent their life studying. You see, Sin Ip was working with a small group of what might be called regular soldiers, and a larger force that was made up of farmers and shopkeepers who had been hastily recruited and barely trained. This was not an ideal force. Recently drafted farmers had a reputation for running once the battle was on. In certain situations, these Chinese battle manuals that all the Korean officers read recommended fighting with the river at your back. While the famous Chinese military mind Sun Tzu normally recommended keeping the water in front of you, he also says of a green and unreliable army, quote, "Drive them into a fatal position and they will come out alive," end quote. The idea is that if your ragtag army has nowhere to run, they will stand and fight because their lives literally depend on it. This tactic famously worked for the Chinese general Han Xin many centuries earlier. Samuel Hawley has argued, and his critic Kenneth Swope has conceded that it's probable, that Sin Ip knew all about the history of this somewhat obscure battle tactic from his deep reading of the Chinese texts. Now, this is a perfect example of what can go wrong when you make military training all about theory and reading the classics. An inflexibly Confucian approach produces guys like Sin Ip, who come up with plans like these. Now, I'm going to speculate a little bit here, so forgive me. But I think that this is the kind of battle plan that would have got you a good grade if you wrote a paper about it in your Confucian military school. I say this as a teacher. I kind of know how teachers think. I am a teacher. Teachers love it when their students use an obscure historical example, demonstrate some deep reading, and come up with a creative interpretation of the texts we're looking at in class. If this battle was presented as a hypothetical situation by a 16th century Korean military examiner, and Sin Ip presented this river to the back solution, he might have been praised for going beyond the surface level and demonstrating a deep knowledge of the Chinese classics. Well done, Sin Ip. You did your homework. In practice, this was a horrific disaster for the Koreans. If the river made the fresh recruits fight any harder, it didn't matter in the face of Japanese arquebuses. The battle quickly turned into a massacre. This seems like a good time to point out that while we're being critical of the Korean military leadership here, we need to remember that the Koreans were the victim of an unprovoked attack. They did not ask for this. They did not deserve this. But man, Sinep, river to the back? Come on, dude. When news reached the capital of the disastrous battle, King Sonjo and his retinue fled the city. This was not a popular move among average Koreans. We're told that the disgusted residents of Seoul loudly taunted their fleeing king as he made his way out of the city. The very public and deeply depressing flight of the king led to an angry bout of nihilistic looting by the people of Seoul. The first few weeks of the Japanese invasion had been incredibly destructive, but by the time the Japanese got to Seoul, they discovered that many buildings had already been burnt by the rioting Koreans, disgusted by the failure of the Joseon dynasty to protect them. By June 11th, just 5 days after the Battle of Cheongju, the Japanese had taken the capital. Konishi ended up beating Kato to the gates by just a few hours. They had only encountered minimal resistance from a handful of Korean contingents who felt honor-bound to die defending Seoul. Seoul, the capital of the Joseon dynasty, was now in the hands of the Japanese. The next stop was the old northern capital of Pyongyang. But in the mad dash to take Seoul, the Japanese had largely ignored the southwestern Chola province and Admiral Yi's naval bases. This would prove to be a deadly miscalculation. The start of the Imjin year had been a disaster for the Koreans, but Admiral Yi was about to change things. Korea was in desperate need of a military man who knew what he was doing. Luckily for them, they had been sleeping on one of history's greatest naval geniuses. The Korean Navy was about to strike back. Okay, that's all for this week. Join us again in 2 weeks' time when we will conclude our trilogy on the Great East Asian War. I have a feeling that part 3 is going to be a meaty one, so look forward to that. Before we go this week, as always, I need to give some shout-outs. Big ups to Chris Doyle, to Charles Oberon, to Aaron Petty, to Robert Hatch, to Eleanor Berry, to Peter Romberg, to Jessica Miles, to Jim Martin, to Christopher Fortin, to Maria Moeller, to Mike Weddle, to Laura Brady, to Scott Boofus, to Bert, to Michael Murray, to John Robbins, to Carl Svartholm, to Benjamin Hurler, and to Peter Schlifke. All of these folks are pledging $5 or more every month on Patreon. So you know what that means. They are beautiful human beings. It's an awesome time to sign up for Patreon. We got a brand new extra episode out there right now on Merlin and a huge list of other extras, not to mention that ad-free feed. Check it out. Patreon.com/OurFakeHistory. But of course, I need to thank everyone that supports this podcast in all sorts of different ways. The people that go to our TeePublic store and buy the merch. The people that just write nice 5-star reviews of the show. That helps. But you know what? The biggest help is just telling people about it. Tell your friends. If they like history, you know what? You might like this show. It's called Our Fake History. It's a lot of fun. That helps. If you would like to get in touch with me, you can always send me an email at ourfakehistory@gmail.com. You can hit me up on Facebook, facebook.com/OurFakeHistory. You can find me on Twitter at OurFakeHistory. You can find me on Instagram at OurFakeHistory. You can find me on TikTok at OurFakeHistory. And don't be afraid to go to the YouTube channel and check out all the cool videos I'm creating there. As always, the theme music for the show comes to us from Dirty Church. Check out more from Dirty Church at dirtychurch.bandcamp.com. All the other music you heard on the show today was written and recorded by me. My name is Sebastian Major, and remember, just because it didn't happen doesn't mean it isn't real.